notes within your conference bag. The other is to announce, unfortunately, that TomNicholson won't be speaking here today. This is unavoidable due to the hurricanes in the States, and obviously we wish him and his family well. Gives me a lot of pleasure to introduce this session. I think it cuts to the very heart of city health, to politics and to public health. All three speakers have something in common, and that is the unique perspective that they bring to this conversation, from the approaches that they take and from their varied backgrounds. I won't spend a lot of time introducing each of them individually. You've got that information on the website. So I'll just say a couple of words before each speaker. We'll then hear from each of them, and then there'll be the opportunity for questions and hopefully a bit of discussion with our actual speakers. Our first speaker is Geoff Gallop, and he has a dual or treble career involving academia, writing and politics, and he's brought those experiences together, I think, to bring particular insights into public health policy and public policy in general. I think the other thing that he and the other two speakers have in common is that commitment to engagement with the communities that we serve. And I think that we'll see how that comes together as being a key theme from this session. If I could hand over to Geoff.
Thank you very much, Jim, and thank you all for attending this session this afternoon, which I think takes us to the heart of many of the issues that we have to address: politics. Can I start with a very simple statement about public health and politics? Just a few definitions to throw out there that I'm sure we all know and understand, but it's worth reminding us about them. Public health, of course, addresses health at a population level. Whether that population is very small, it might be a local area, whether it's a region, a town, or it might even be a city or a nation. It's necessarily interdisciplinary. It looks at the social, economic and environmental determinants of health, and its work is achieved, as the CDC in the USA puts it, by promoting healthy lifestyles, researching disease and injury prevention, and detecting, preventing and responding to infectious diseases. So it's dealing with a whole community, whether it's a locality or whether it's a nation, or whether it's a region within our globe. As Michelle said this morning, there are parts of the world that can be compared and contrasted in terms of the results that come from their policies or lack of policies. Politics takes us into a completely different space. Politics is about influence. It's about power. Within those localities, regions, nations, or the global community itself, it's about who the winner is and who the loser is. When it comes to the laws, the regulations, the distribution of resources within not just government, but also the community more generally considered. So public health takes us to the population level, whether that's a locality through to a nation or a global region. Politics is about who has power and influence in those localities, in those communities. So even when you put the definition out there, you can see that politics and public health are intermixed in a very important way. Now, there's a scientist in all of us, and it's one of the better aspects of humanity that there's a scientist in us. It takes us to think about what works and what doesn't work. It takes us to do research. and to find out what is actually the case as opposed to what people might think the case to be. It evaluates performance as well as just carry it out and then forget about the consequences that might flow, and they might be different from the intentions. In other words, what needs to be done is done if we use science. Politics being of a form that we might call applied science. That's one way of looking at politics. Applied science. Find out what works, what doesn't work, what the laws of the world are, and then apply those to government. It's pure and it's simple. And it's one way of looking at the art of politics, the application of science to policy. But of course, there's a realist in all of us as well. There's a realist in all of us as well that tells us that politics, when it comes to decision making, isn't always rational. Who sets the agenda? Who sits at the table of power? Who can best influence the decision makers within the government and the community? What factors come into play when decisions are being made? In this scenario, public health is there. And all of the evidence that we associate with it, it's there, but it's with other things. And those other things are ideas. The ideas may in fact be prejudices. Interests, vested interests are there. Public opinion is there, along with evidence. And so when you go from the scientific world into the political world, we would hope that evidence goes with you, but inevitably it's part of a bigger mix and a more complicated mix. So what I want to look at today, in the time I have available, is to look at when you have the evidence and you're taking it into the political equation, what are the factors that might mean that that evidence won't be taken seriously or will indeed be rejected? What are the factors that influence the effectiveness of the evidence that we have? What do the people who believe in evidence come up against? And I've identified a number of factors that I just briefly want to talk about. The first is fundamentalism. Religious fundamentalism, ideological fundamentalism. It leads to watertight beliefs which evidence-based arguments can't penetrate. For the fundamentalist, it is values, not values and evidence, that should determine law and regulation. A classic case study, of course, is the international war on drugs. Ideologically very pure, but seriously challenged in the real world in terms of the objectives that we would reasonably expect of it. So there's the first challenge for science. How do we respond to that? Well, the first thing I think we need to do is stand up for science and its methodologies with a humanistic element. What does any policy mean for actually existing and sometimes flawed human beings? I've just been to a session where one of the attendants and the speakers talked about what's happened in Crimea since the Russians came back in terms of opioid substitution therapy and what that actually means for the individuals living there. So I think it's a point of getting our heart and soul into it and put across to the fundamentalists, of course, that yes, you have your views, but the world is more complicated, and as a result of sticking rigidly to your view, these consequences come that are not in anyone's interests. Which brings me to the second problem that we can get, and they're not necessarily in order here. The second one is vested interests. It goes without saying that virtually every initiative designed to improve public health will affect actually existing interests, whether they're personal, commercial, or political. The public interests will more often than not challenge these private interests, and campaigns to oppose evidence-based change will inevitably result. Some transparent and some behind the scenes. Such campaigns frighten politicians and they can be very sophisticated and effective. So, for believers in evidence, think politically. Look for alliances that you can use in the political battle, that you can have there with you when the vested interests come in and play their particular game of defending policies and institutions that may not be producing good results for the people. Then there's risk. Politicians vary in type and style. Some are very risk averse. Some are very cautious. On the other hand, some are quite entrepreneurial and quite happy to take a big risk. The risk-averse politicians will worry not only about the politics of dealing with fundamentalists and vested interests, but a range of other factors will come into their thinking. A policy may be a good one in theory, but what about its feasibility in the context in which it's to be established? Are the capabilities and resources there to make it work? Is there adequate political support to survive a campaign of opposition? So when believers in evidence go to the political arm and advocate, they should not ignore these questions of implementation and questions of opinion. Politicians will want to know how to manage those risks, what resources will be needed for success, and how opinion is to be influenced. If you have thought through the implications of the issues, it's much easier to convince governments on what should be done. Remember, a good public policy is not just relevant and evidence-based, but it's also feasible and acceptable. Then we go to the issue of trust. The credibility of researchers is always on the line, not just one to the other and through peer review, but also to the general public and their political representatives. Advocates should never oversell their findings or cut corners in order to exaggerate an argument. This can undermine the risk of the scientist so easily, because science is so important, evidence is so important, that we should never sacrifice it in small ways that would appear to perhaps gain us an edge in the short term, but over a period of time may undermine belief in science as such. Politicians do a lot of spinning, as we know, spin, where you exaggerate or you put a flavour around something that's not really in accord with its reality. And evidence people may be inclined to join that school of thought, but they put at peril their greatest asset, which is their scientifically grounded recommendations. So maintaining the highest of standards in research and advocacy is very important. But let me now say something else about trust. Trust is not just an attitude that emerges, but is also a factor that can be developed. And Jim has already indicated in his preliminary comments one way to do that. Institutions of higher education and research should be vigorously independent, but not disengaged. What matters to the community needs to have analysis, needs to have solutions. And those of us who engage in research are in a good position to offer good advice on all of those issues. Go into the community, find out what's going on, what are the problems that are emerging, and seek to bring about solutions. Now, sometimes, as Michelle said this morning, there are activists throughout our own region here that in some parts take risks in doing those important things via engagement with the community who needs assistance. But it's so important. That trust does build up. And when people are confident that what the researchers are saying produces good results, it's very interesting to see that there's not usually a turning back. Let me talk about my own country of Australia. Australia has gone a fair way down the path of harm reduction. Not the whole way, but has gone a fairly significant way. But every time there's now an attempt to push back, there's resistance, because it's been institutionalised. It's part of the system. People have seen the good results, and efforts to try and go back don't work. So by engaging with the community, taking up their issues, offering good results, you do build up a support base that's very important. Another issue that can come up in terms of evidence is the question of priorities, and it was raised by someone this morning in a question. Public health competes with resources in all sorts of ways. Within the budget, within the health budget, you can spend money on hospitals, you can spend money on community-based education, all sorts of ways you can spend money. And priorities will always be there. Governments will have priorities that may or not be your priorities. Particular circumstances will matter, and crises can quickly create demands for a change in policy. Even a government regarded as on side with public health won't necessarily be able to do everything that you may want. So one step at a time, I think, is usually the way in which we can achieve some of these important results. Be up to date on what's happening in the world. Know about the constellation of forces that are there. Be patient when necessary and bold when circumstances demand it. We had a very interesting presentation in Australia recently from Portugal on their drug policy when a major crisis was developing in their society, was affecting all segments, and they had a very bold response to it. But they were ready for the response. So even though sometimes we need to be patient, sometimes we need to be bold when circumstances permit. Finally, there's the question of communication. I simply make a very tactical point here, that the world occupied by the researcher, the scientific world, is quite different from that of the politician, the political world. The time constraints under which they work are different. Using the right words, explaining in an understandable way, and getting it all across in a time-constrained environment can be very difficult. But should never be taken for granted. Think about the person or the persons that you're addressing when making a case. Don't assume things about them that are unrealistic. They will almost certainly not be from a research background and perhaps not even academically credentialed. So think about it. I put it this way. There's all this wonderful research goes on. It slowly builds up. Recommendations follow from the research that will produce good results. That filters into government. The bureaucracy know about it. The bureaucracy then want to go to the politician. And you know what that means? A half-hour meeting with the minister, usually. That's where a policy... And you want that minister to take it up and take it into a cabinet and try and make a policy. And if you muck up, if I can use that Australian expression, I don't know, if you can not successfully transmit the idea, it may fall back, and what is a good idea may not become a reality. So make that last half hour really count. Really work on it, how you're going to present. So I think there's some of the issues that I think come up when you're having to deal with the political side of things and you have good evidence. But my last point is to just quickly say that we're now living in a different world. It's amazing to think that what we thought was a scientific underpinning to everything that we did is being questioned. It's being questioned. Reliance on beliefs and treating your opinion as a fact, rather than saying, well, that's my opinion, let's examine it, explore what it means in practice. A distrust of science and all of the inconvenient truths that science is throwing up. A prioritisation of feelings over reasoned argument. Complacency about or hostility to politics and the open society. This is a real challenge. I mean, I mentioned 8 factors that come up when you're trying to influence government. This is the big issue of the contemporary world, where the questioning of the very methodology that is behind what we're doing in conferences like this is being questioned at the highest levels of government. And recently in the United States, the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta were having a meeting, and they were told that when they make submissions for the budget, there were certain words they shouldn't use. Diversity, entitlement, vulnerable, fetus, transgender, science-based, evidence-based. This is an assault on the very foundations of the open society and the results that it can produce to improve the welfare of people. So we need to defend science And it's, as the Albert Einstein Memorial at the National Academy says, the right to search for truth implies also a duty. One must not conceal any part of what one has recognised to be true. And I think more than ever, we need to really focus on those issues and make sure that the wider world understands the implications of the rejection of those views and what it means for real human beings living in our society. But finally, let me just say something about how we should proceed as researchers and advocates. I won't go into any detail there. Tom Nichols has written a book on expertise. He makes the point that we should strive to do it better than we're doing it now. And finally, if I can finish with the point I made at the last City Health International Conference in Basel, I think we should be looking at new ways to consider complex problems by involving the community in a different way through citizens' juries, people's assemblies, where reason plus evidence plus deliberation in those mini publics can look at public policy generally. So, ladies and gentlemen, just to conclude, I think we need to think politically when it comes to taking evidence into the sphere of government. Think about all of those problems, because what you find is so important. It's so important. We must make sure that it's effective in the political world. But finally, I think this post-truth phenomenon represents the major challenge to all of the work that we've been doing over many years, and that's a culture war that can't be avoided. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Geoff. That was excellent, and I'm sure we'll be picking up on some of those themes during the questions. Next, I'd like to invite Kарлlo Fabian up to the microphone. Carlo's a professor at the University of Applied Sciences and Art, Northwest Switzerland. He also has experience with not-for-profit organisations. He has experience within addiction. And I think it's going to be fascinating seeing your views and assessments around the setting approach, in particular from your department and your discipline.
Yes, good afternoon. Thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here. And thank you to the organizers for this conference. I was the organizer, local organizer and local host last year in Basel, and I know there is a lot of work to do before such a fantastic conference is set up. So thank you very much. The setting approach, a critical appraisal. Why should we talk about the setting approach? And I think there are many reasons that we should. One is what we heard this morning, Tom, when he talked about the Amsterdam model and how they worked, he said a few very interesting points. He said, you can do it. He stressed the importance and power of the city. And at the end, he said, try to do it with the system or try to change the system. You are the system. And this is a really important point also in the setting approach, as we will see in a few minutes. But there are also other reasons. Another one is that this year I attended the Making Cities Livable conference in Ottawa in Canada. It was a great conference. Topics were walkability, 10 minutes, neighborhoods, well-being and health, and so on. And there was a lot of discussion about how to develop neighborhoods and cities to promote well-being and health. As a health psychologist, but also as a person working in health promotion and prevention and also in urban development, I expected that the Ottawa Charter for Health Promotion and the setting approach would be presented and discussed very prominently at this conference since we were in Ottawa. But nobody mentioned the setting approach or the Ottawa Charter. These discussions and questions how these developments of the neighborhoods and cities could be approached were, in my opinion, somewhere awkward. Most of the proposed ideas concerned architectural aspects, public transport, and, at best, meeting zones in public space. These aspects are good and important, but they fell short if you want to do something broad and sustainable. I tried to include at this conference a setting approach in the discussions, but nearly nobody knew the setting approach, except to a few people from the health sector. This is a pity because I am convinced that the model, the framework for action of the setting approach offers excellent opportunities to comprehensively tackle neighborhood and urban development projects. Also, and this is maybe a first critical point, also the evidence on the approach is not yet very broad. There are important good empirical bases and evidence that show that the approach is effective. In my view, it is really important to remember this approach, and this is what I'm doing now. Oh, my slides, yes. Okay. Before we look at the setting approach, first of all, what is health promotion and prevention? And Geoff also mentioned a few points. The function of health promotion is to enable people to increase control over their own health. And you see in this sentence that people are in the center of health promotion. Prevention wants the elimination or reduction of certain undesirable behaviors and environmental conditions. The goals are to strengthen protection factors and to reduce risk factors. But again, the methods and actions to do so, we see there is an immense number of measures, but not all are effective. There are good reasons why in 1986, so 32 years ago, the Ottawa Charter introduced the innovative and holistic setting approach. We see here some critical points. Health promotion measures to date fall short of the mark. There was too much focus on behavioral training and personal responsibility. Actions and temporary projects were typical. The range was too short. They reached more desensitized ones, but not other persons. And the measures were not sufficiently sensitive to the social situation. Now, the Ottawa Charter, in principle, it's about the following 2 points quoted over here. You can see health promotion works through concrete and effective community action. So again, the community is in the center. In setting priorities, making decisions, planning strategies, and implementing them to achieve better health. And then goes on and says, at the heart of this process is the empowerment of communities, and also Geoff talked about communities, the ownership and control of their own endeavors and destinies. And if you read further, you see that existing human and material resources are important, the self-help and social support and the public participation are important issues. Health promotion pays particular attention to participation and co-decision of the population, as well as to the involvement of the public. And at the end, health promotion is an emancipatory approach. It's at least in some parts a bottom-up approach. Certainly it's not a top-down approach like most actions in health promotion and also prevention. What is a setting? A setting is a social context. So the social is important here. That is relatively permanent. And there are different attributes characterizing these settings. There are formal organizations, regional situation like municipality, district, or neighborhoods, the common life situation, but also, and this is also a real important point if we talk about Ottawa Charter and setting approach, the values and preferences. I will come back to this later. At the end, the objective is to promote health supportive living environments and settings. This slide is important to understand what the setting approach really is. The setting approach means much more than the achievement of the target group within the setting. What we see here in red, color red, settings as a frame for the intervention. In this view, health promotion and prevention is done in the setting. The setting forms a framework for the intervention, and it guarantees accessibility and identification. So the focus is on the individual and it's behavior oriented. But the meaning, what the setting is and the setting approach is what you can see here in the green picture. The setting is the object of the intervention. Health promotion, and it's really important, and health promotion and prevention is done with the setting, so with the people together. The environmental conditions of the setting that affect health are developed, and the focus is on the structural developments. There are two reasons why this this understanding of the setting is important. First, it is known that the context conditions of a setting affect our health and the health of the members of the settings. These contextual conditions include structural, formal, and cultural aspects, and these cultural aspects also include attitudes and values. A setting in which, for example, sexism, racism, ageism, or homophobia prevail has negative consequences for the affected members, but also for other people in the setting. The good thing is that precisely these contextual conditions that can be made the object of the project or a longer-term development. Preventive and health-promoting interventions can be aimed directly at changing the context, including values and attitudes. The second point, second reason concerns the processes of how it can be done. And here the focus is on joint development, empowerment, and participation. That is really crucial. The challenge here is that participation is not just a method, how to involve people. Above all, it's also an attitude. It's an attitude whether you want to involve people, it's an attitude whether you want to share the power, and it's an attitude if you want to share competencies, including decision competencies, at least in certain aspects. Also here, the good thing is that it is feasible, and there are many good examples that show that this can be done. Also, this graphic is important. It's a simplified way that shows the complexity of the setting approach. On the right side, we first have the known individual-focused approaches. These are still important, but then we have also on the other side the context-oriented approaches on the left, as I mentioned before. And the third integral element of this model is participation. These are aspects, these three aspects need to be coordinated and implemented in a coherent unit. It is always a holistic way of working. This slide shows what participation is. It's important to show that participation does not stop with information for the people or with assessment of needs. But this is what we see in many projects, that they say we have a participatory approach, but they stop after the assessment. Participation means also include the people in developing, collaborating to be part of the decisions. And this is really a crucial point in the setting approach. Again, the setting approach means much more than the achievement of the target group within the settings. I think I have mentioned most of these points on the slide, so I want to pick up only this one, public health action cycle is a part of the method when you work within the setting approach. So the 4 phases are problem determination, strategy, implementation, and evaluation. And it's really important also to evaluate at the end what you have done what you wanted, and have you achieved your goals. And so this is a part of the evidence production that we heard also in the previous talk, really important. In more recent literature now, there is mention of supersettings. First, we see on the left side, there are the already known principles that I have mentioned. In this model, supersetting means, for example, that the municipality that can be seen as a setting, and it's containing many more sub-settings like worksite, hospital, school, nursing home, and so on. And if you work with a setting approach, you can work within the entire supersetting or with the individual subsettings. This model allows a certain complexity to be subdivided in sub-elements, and this can help when the setting, for example, a city, is too large, the scale is too large to work with participatory and community-oriented methods. Well, for me, this approach is not really new. Almost 20 years ago, we worked with municipalities in Switzerland in exactly this way. We had all these sub-settings included in a bigger setting, and we have done a lot of development work. What you see here is an example of a participatory process in a community, in a municipality, also in Switzerland. It was almost 10 years ago. And here we worked with many stakeholders at this local level, such as young people, older people, professionals, representatives of many institutions such as schools, administration, gastronomy, and so on. And we wanted to jointly work out what challenges exist in this community, in this municipality, what resources they have already, but also what ideas were available for development among the stakeholders participating. And this was always the first step in a longer joint process for prevention. What you see here is the example of setting-oriented tobacco prevention project in schools and municipality, also in Switzerland. And what you can see here is the result. After a lot and long preparatory work, the pupils designed and texted these posters together with the teachers, with prevention experts, with adults, with the print shop, with the graphic artists in their village. With these posters, a concern of the pupils is documented, but something which could be shared already in development with others. In these posters, it says on the left side, smoke-free zone, because everyone needs liberty, and smoke-free zone, because respect is important. And we had a scientific evaluation of this project, and we see it worked. It worked. In the public space, around sport events and so on, the adults hardly smoked anymore after this setting-oriented approach. We have seen the setting approach means intervention in social systems. It's a holistic concept. It aims for long-term changes, and it's focused on self-development of the system. So Tom said, change the system, and here we see we can change the system. But the setting approach is also, to some extent, a normative concept. As I have said at the beginning, impact research is difficult because the systems are complex and many uncontrolled influences have an effect. But there are many indications and there is evidence that the approach is an effective framework for health promotion and prevention. Approaches such as good practice or best practice, as well as evidence concepts, that includes both, on one side, the science-based evidence, but also the practice-based evidence are suitable. Come to my last slide. What I want to show here is we just finished a small research project, literature research. We wanted to know what are the success factors and recommendations for prevention projects according to the setting approach, such as municipalities. And we have found literature-based, evidence-based 21 factors on different levels like planning and concept, structure, process, and outcomes. And I want just to mention only 2 points at the structure level. You can see here the regional cooperation and local working group. And here again, these are success factors involving the people, work with the people in these settings. So what we can see here now, the setting approach is, from the Ottawa Charter, is much more than a normative concept. And for the end, if you want to do it, if you want to take the time, and if you want to invest enough resources to work with the setting approach, then the people in the settings can only win. So it is like Michel said this morning, it's a question of choice. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carlo, for that really interesting talk. Now for our third speaker, Anke Van Dam. Anke, again, has a diverse and interesting background encompassing her work as a general practitioner, but also working at international level with organizations such as WHO, UN, and the Red Cross. She's now working as Executive Director at AFU, and I think at the center of all Anke's work is the care for the vulnerable and ensuring fairness in things that we do. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that nice introduction, Jim, and thanks to the organizers for allowing me to speak to you. And while preparing this presentation, I could not have imagined that it would fit so well to the previous speakers, because, Geoff, you were talking about these mini partnerships with organizations, communities, and that it is so essential for politicians. And Carlo, you are talking about the communities, and I will talk about civil society and a specific aspect that is, I think, very relevant, not only in Eastern Europe and Central Asia, but I think more and more in the rest of the world, and that is the shrinking space for civil society. But I will focus on Eastern Europe and Central Asia. And when I talk about civil society, I mean NGOs, non-governmental organizations, but all kinds of organizations and institutions that represent citizens. Because, yeah, it is really under threat now, civil society, and I will show you, and it really has to do with politics. And while I was preparing my presentation, I thought, should I say something about the war on drugs? Well, happily, Michel and also Geoff mentioned it. So I want to point it out, but I will not talk about this. But of course, when you think about politics and public health, for me, there's an immediate link with the restrictive drug policies, which do so many harm, and that doesn't allow people who use drugs to health and healthcare. So I will not talk about this. And I also will not talk about the criminalization of people who use drugs, sex workers, and LGBTQI groups. That was already pointed out this morning by Michel. I just want to tell you that 9 regional networks in Eastern Europe and Central Asia combined their efforts to develop a campaign chase the virus, not people, that addresses that criminalization. And hopefully we can continue and raise attention to this important issue in this region. And I will not raise, but I want to mention it, the situation around middle-income countries and the situation that international donors are withdrawing from middle-income countries. And I think that's also a political decision. It was already mentioned this morning, middle-income countries also face issues and HIV problems with the key populations at risk. And you cannot expect from a government where, for instance, drug use is criminalized, that they will fund healthcare facilities for people who use drugs. But I will not raise this, but I want to mention it. Here I come to the topic of my speech, and that is the shrinking space for civil society. And one of the major laws that has a great impact on that shrinking space for civil society is the foreign agent law that was already a couple of years ago installed in Russia and is now also being under discussion, and some aspects already are installed in other countries in the world. So what is important for civil society, and that is a background of this topic, and that is we face as civil society, and also my organization, AFU International and AFU Network, working in Eastern Europe and Central Asia, face more and more restrictive legislation. And this has a risk for the HIV response, and I can also look at that one, and the situation for key populations. But you know, civil society organizations who play such an important role in public health aspects, in reaching out to the most vulnerable groups in society, in offering health services, in offering psychosocial care, you know, we as civil society are resilient, and I would like to give you some examples later in my speech as well. So, AFU International has done an assessment, and a couple of objectives, the objectives of this assessment were that we wanted to know and analyze the situation in a couple of countries with regards to NGOs, laws and regulations. But we also wanted to know the position of NGOs in this legal framework. And we also wanted to know how donors are reacting on these NGOs, laws and regulations. So we collected data by desk research, and we did a literature scan, and we interviewed experts from NGOs, but also from authorities, and we also interviewed some donors and listened to their reaction and way of dealing with this shrinking space for civil society. This is a map from the Freedom House nations, and this shows the situation with regards to democracy. And I show you here Central Europe and Eastern Europe and Central Asia. And you can see the blue color in quite some countries in Eastern Europe and Central Asia, where it is said to have a consolidated authoritarian regime. Ukraine and Georgia are listed by the Freedom House as transitional government or hybrid regimes. And this tells you something about, you know, laws and regulations and how those governments perceive civil society and NGOs. It is a very challenging environment for civil society now. I mentioned already the foreign agents law in Russia, and for those who don't know, it means that if an NGO receives international money, they have to report that to the government, and they are registered then as a foreign agent. And they are then also more closely monitored for the work that they do. Recently, the Russian Ministry of Justice So first of all, this foreign agent law was installed for human rights organizations, and then more and more NGOs fell under that law. And recently, the Russian Ministry of Justice also told that this applies for HIV organizations, and that if HIV organizations receive international funding, they have to show their project first to the Ministry of Justice, and then the Ministry of Justice decides if they agree with the intervention and the approach or not. And if you don't agree, then you cannot implement the activities. Like I said, it's not only in Russia that we have this law. Also in Tajikistan, there is a law on public associations, and that also obligates NGOs to notify the Ministry of Justice about grants and other aid received from abroad. In Uzbekistan, we have the same regulations, but there you also have to announce when you are going to travel abroad. So there is more control in Uzbekistan about the movements of NGOs and civil society. So what is the response to these challenges? What we can see, and I will elaborate a little bit more on the different strategies that NGOs take to cope with this very restrictive situation. But you see activists that are really willing to take the risk and openly criticize authorities, like Geoff already mentioned. They really, are demonstrating and advocating for change. But as a civil society organization, you can also reach out to public funding, like for instance in Russia, to the presidential grants, and then therefore decide to ally with the authorities. So you either fully obey or you silently continue your unpopular activities in the eyes of the government. So these are the two extremes, but in there are the different strategies that NGOs take. There are also countries in Central Europe that have quite a rapid shift of political environment and culture, and there is a quick decrease of political rights and civic freedoms, and this is happening in Hungary and in Poland. And there you see that NGOs, have to react on that change in environment, and you see the responses having different phases. So first of all, there is this strategy of silence. So we don't know what will happen. So we resign from advocacy. We don't attract too much attention from the authorities. And then you start concentrating on securing your status quo, and you limit your advocacy activities for further positive changes. But then, when the situation continues, you have to prepare for the bad to come, and then also to secure the sustainability of your organization, you have to find maybe other ways of fundraising. And that is what we see happening now in Poland and in Hungary. So although these countries had quite a good situation for NGOs, it can suddenly change. And I think that's also, a lesson learned for NGOs. There's never a dull moment. So what are the donor responses to this shrinking space of civil society? And so we looked at a couple of donors, like the Global Fund, Open Society Foundation, UNODC, Dutch government, etc. And we also interviewed a couple of these donors. And we see indeed that donors are withdrawing because they also want to get most out of their money. And if you give money to an organization who cannot do the work, then why should you give that money? So you see a withdrawal from quite some donors. But there are also donors who continue to give support, and they really find creative ways of enabling an environment where you can still fundraise and give financial support. And I think that is very, very nice and very good to see. So there is not just, one approach of donors. But what does it mean that still quite a number of donors withdraw from the region? Because it has severe consequences for civil society. There was not had that big money already for this region, but now with the pot of money getting smaller and smaller, you can imagine that there will be more competition among NGOs. And that the NGOs will tailor their activities to the wishes of the donor and not so much to the needs that are there in reality. You will stop with a number of activities. And then you have to rely on your domestic funding, also with the risk, I mentioned it already, a local government not supporting harm reduction activities in your country. So you are maybe then also limited, you're for sure limited in your mandate. So the result is that civil society organizations have to develop new strategies and innovative tools to cope with the situation. So in our analysis, in our assessment to the shrinking space of civil society, we identified 3 coping strategies, 3 categories, and that is the strategy of fight, hide, and unite. And I would like to explain first the unite strategy. And the unite strategy is that as an NGO, you reach out to the local authorities, you reach out to the government, and you offer your expertise in reaching their policy goals. And your professional expertise can also allow you, can function as a protection. So you're not completely, a governmental NGO. You have your expertise, but for the sake of your work, for the sake of helping the people that you were already helping, you reach out to the government and you obey to their rules. But it is not only uniting with local authorities. What is also happening is that you unite with other NGOs. You unite with other key populations. If you are an NGO working with people who use drugs, you work together with a sex workers organization or an LGBT organization, because together you are stronger and you can raise your voice more importantly. And this uniting strategy also, allows you to apply for presidential grants, domestic grants, but it also allows you to advocate for this social granting system. So you still have your agenda of creating more financial means for the work that NGOs and civil society is doing. You have to be fully transparent, and you work in line with the bureaucracy. And you include representatives of the authorities. And that is also, on the one hand, a good thing, because you train then governmental officials for the important work that you do and for the topics that you think are so important. The hide strategy, and that is that you tell the world and the government that you work in topics that are defined as public health. So you avoid talking about controversial topics and activities, but you still do so under the umbrella of public health. And you still do actually what you are doing, but not so much in the open. So therefore you do not communicate that much about your work you do. You don't do any campaigns. And another approach another element of this hide strategy is that you work under a regional cover. So you have regional activities. You may not maybe allowed, you're not allowed to work in one specific country, but you can invite people from that specific country to trainings in another country where it is allowed. You can also have informal networks of not registered organizations. So you do your work, but you're not registered. And of course, that is difficult with regards to funding, but somehow organizations still find money. There's a lot of volunteer work, people with, it's already mentioned, with their heart in the right place and who are really willing to serve their constituencies, and so they work in this way. And the last strategy I want to discuss is the fight strategy. And that is that you do not apply for local funding, you do not apply for domestic resources, and you search for alternative funding. You do private fundraising, community financing, and you openly address the issues that hamper your work of the government, and that you can bring, for instance, these cases when you are in a very activistic organization to court. Again, there it is important not to do it by your own as an NGO, but to seek for alliances with other organizations and do maybe more regional advocacy instead of national advocacy. It is actually also, as an activist organization, it's very important to have a good partnerships, because if you have wide partnerships, you really stand stronger. So we identified these three coping strategies to this shrinking space of civil society. What I wanted to address is that it is also politics and public health, I think. It's really a pity that local governments perceive NGOs, some local governments perceive some NGOs as their enemies. And I think well, I mentioned it already before, and I think the speeches from Kарло and Geoff also pointed it out. Communities are such an important ally for governments to really have an improved quality of life for all the people in the countries. Another point that I wanted to raise is that none of these strategies are the best, I would say. And some NGOs choose not deliberately for a specific strategy. And what you see is also that NGOs come from a unite strategy into a hide strategy, or from a fight strategy into a unite strategy. So it's kind of fluent. And I think another important message that I want to give is that we as NGOs also should understand why some NGOs choose for that specific strategy. So it sometimes happens that an activist or an activist NGO, well, is a bit disrespectful to an NGO who prefers the unite strategy. But I think we all serve the same purpose, and that is a better health for all. Thank you so much.
If I could ask the three speakers to take the seats at the front, and we're ready for some questions. Okay, can I ask for the first question, please? Can I ask for the second question? Sorry, a gentleman there, please.
Представиться, да? Меня зовут Олег Гриб, это наркологическая клиника «Либерон», город Одесса. У меня вопрос к госпоже... Да. Да. Можно, да?
Okay.
У меня вопрос к госпоже Анке Ван Дам. Вы рассказывали нам очень много о ограничении гражданских свобод в условиях стран Восточной Европы, Центральной Азии, всего этого региона. Я хотел вас спросить, а по вашему мнению, не является ли в западных странах продолжающаяся секуляризация и отдаление от, скажем так, каких-то идеалов христианства, которое, собственно, и родило западную цивилизацию, тоже наступлением на гражданские свободы? И это тоже, в свою очередь, может приводить к ухудшению общественного здоровья, которое проявляется в усилении психических заболеваний, в депрессиях и в уменьшении рождаемости, которая является проблемой в Западной Европе. Спасибо.
Thank you. Did everyone actually get the question? Yeah. Do you want to? We'll throw it open to whoever would like to step in first.
As I interpret the question, it was to argue that we were using sort of a Western value system to criticise others, but that Western value system was not producing good results for the community. Is that? That is correct?
Yeah.
Look, obviously, those of us that live in, democratic countries that have had a long tradition of liberty would not argue that those societies are perfect, or indeed that there are important issues that don't need to be addressed because of the progress that's been made. Quite the contrary. I think the whole point of what we might call, if we like to use the term Western, it's a problematical term, but let's use it for a second, Western, is its openness to criticism. And I think that's the key point. Open society means that you're open to criticism, which means you're open to develop further your views and you're continually trying to improve them. So if there's a problem, it needs to be addressed. And the problem you mentioned was that there are, anxiety and mental health issues that have been established throughout lots of Western countries. You can see the way they're now responding to that. They're developing anti-stigma programs, etc. So
I'm sorry. Я имел в виду не проблему психических каких-то расстройств, депрессии и так далее. Я имел в виду проблему секуляризации. То есть это наступление государства на религиозные чувства верующих. То есть это ограничение свободы проявления вероисповедания и так далее. То есть, в принципе, христианство, оно породило западную цивилизацию и привело ее в то состояние, которое сейчас находится западная цивилизация. И сейчас в странах западного мира наблюдается тенденция о том, что государство, скажем так, способствует тому, что в сознании граждан церковь и церковные моменты отделяются от населения. И не считаете ли вы, что это тоже может, в свою очередь, приводить к ухудшению психического здоровья и к уменьшению численности стран Западной Европы?
I can't agree with you on that. I think that when you have a good balance in society between liberalism, liberty and equality, the French, liberty, equality, fraternity, let's put fraternity to one side for a second. That was to defend the revolution against the monarchies. Liberty plus equality. If you have a good balance between those two in your society, mental health levels, I think you can establish through evidence, are better than if you have a too oppressive or authoritarian society. Now, in respect to Christianity, there's no question of its role it's played in Western civilization. Indeed, its role it's played in the development of a concept of freedom of thinking. But really, lots of the separation of church and state, the application of egalitarian principles, the support for the vulnerable in the society are very much Christian principles, as I understand them from the parable of the Good Samaritan, the New Testament, etc. So I don't think what the Western society is doing as an open society that will engage and criticise itself is in any way inconsistent with my interpretation of what the Christian scriptures indicate are a possibility. So I don't see a contradiction there. And indeed, if you have a good balance between liberty and equality, I think you'll get better mental health overall.
I can add one point, maybe, if you have seen the Ottawa Charter and the setting, the definition of the setting have different characteristics, and it says there is a variety, diversity in these characteristics, and one of them is religion, and you have to include all the people, not dependent on what they believe, what they do, how they act, and then work together with the people, with the community, to find the best solutions for this community. So I think that the Ottawa Charter has an approach that goes beyond this point that you mentioned.
Yeah, well, the first thing that comes up in my mind is you are very much referring to Christianity. But I think there's also freedom of religion, and I think it is also very much about inclusion of all kinds of religion. I'd just like to agree with what Geoff said. There are changes. There is the secularization, and it is happening. And in some countries, you see again a revival of Christianity, and I think these are I think periods and episodes in life. But I don't want that religion influences politics.
If we can go to the next question. That question would be from me then. Geoff, it seems from how you were describing things that we have a problem with critical thinking. I mean, as a species, are we doing enough to... It occurred to me, your presentation was fascinating, and I find it difficult to understand whether people agree with it or not, how that doesn't spark interest. But the vast majority of people, it would seem, are not interested in politics. They're not interested in many of the important things in our world. What do we do about that? And that's a question for all of you.
Well, I think you've raised a very tough question there. I think if you're serious about improving the well-being of your community, both individually in terms of the individuals and collectively the type of society and the impact it has on the individuals, if you're very serious about achieving that as a goal, you have to bring the people into the equation. You have to bring the people into the equation. Fabian had one point, he talked about practice-based evidence, I think, was it that you were saying. The alliance between the researchers and the establishment and the politicians and the governments and the people is the issue of democracy. It has been since the ancient Greeks. It has been when democracy was sort of introduced in a radical form in Italy in the late 15th century. That there has to be a relationship there, and that relationship has been broken over, I think, the globalisation period from 1989 roughly through to the crisis of 2008. I think the liberty side of the liberty and equality equation took over. We forgot about social solidarity. We forgot about equality. We didn't forget, sorry, I'm exaggerating, that the emphasis was too much in that direction, and the result we've got is a gap between government and people. Now, two ways to fill the gap. You just do what the people say in the opinion polls. No solution there, because there's no reflection, there's no self-criticism in that. But bring the people in a way where you say, this is our problem, put it to them in a proper way, engage with them, put the options. I think humanity can go higher in its response to things. It can go beyond nationalism. It can go beyond ethnocentrism. It can go beyond its own little groups to the bigger group, which is humanity as a whole. That potentiality is there in the human spirit. But, you know, we've got to work with people to bring that out, as opposed to the narrower, nationalistic, you know, more sort of self-interested type of approach. So in answer to your question, yes, I think that spirit is there. But at the moment, there's a gap between the governments of the world and the people that's been feeding into this alternative approach to thinking and politics. To break that gap down, I think we need innovative ways to involve the people in decision-making. And governments that do that, it would seem to me, are the ones that are being supported if they're willing to take that risk and to involve the people in new ways, such as citizens' juries, assemblies, etc.
Yeah, in our cities project, so Odessa is one of the cities of our 5 cities that are involved in the cities project that we implement together with the Alliance for Public Health. We try to engage the municipal authorities, and there's one big lesson, and that is that the local NGOs have to learn what the interest is of the mayor and the municipal authorities. And indeed, so when you start working, you think that your problem, you know, is known to everyone. And you mentioned it already about that communication. And you have to map and look for people in these authorities who can be your ally. And you're right, there is not so much interest in doing that, but it is so important. So this is one of the strategies in our project. But so then it comes from the civil society side, and what we see is that so far it's really hard to get, for instance, the mayors involved in our activities. So it is so important to look at issues where you can create a win-win situation. And I think that is also very important to get people indeed interested again in politics. Also, you know, at a very local level, is that you try to identify where you can really together find something where you both benefit from. And I think that doesn't happen that often.
I think that the setting approach is an approach for a small scale. What we have done in Switzerland, we have worked with a lot of municipalities, and we worked and in Switzerland we have a lot of municipalities up to 8 or 10,000 inhabitants living there. So really small communities, municipalities, and in this small case, it's possible, and it works really well to work with the politicians, administration, and all stakeholders in this municipality. And then it's possible with this participatory process to find together new solutions. And our experience is that not the solutions, the ideas that politicians or administration have in advance are at the end the best solutions, but the solutions developed together. And what I said at the beginning, the important point is the attitude that the people with the power want to share the power and want to share the competences for decisions. Then it can work, and then I think politics, people, civil society can be connected very well.
We take one more question.
Gentleman just in the front.
Thank you. There is another power that you haven't been discussing, which is that of multinationals and private sector. And so I don't think we should just look at politics and public health, thinking of government, civil society, democratic dialogue. When it comes to obesity in children, the decisions are not made by the politicians. They're made in boardrooms of multinationals dealing with sugar drinks. So I wonder whether you would like to comment on this.
No, you start.
An obvious and important point that the decision-making centres of power are not just governments but also corporations, and really the corporations at one level have to be tamed by government regulation and law. We can't have a repeat of the financial crisis, for example, which has had huge implications for the work lots of people do in this room, and that happened because regulation became too slack and we weren't in a position to ensure that the market worked to the benefit of everyone. So that's point number one. I think point number two is that we do need to have governments that represent the interests of the public interest as opposed to vested interests, and that I think is a political issue. And the only way for that to happen, so that sugar taxes are introduced and we deal with obesity in terms of what corporations do, is for people to be in charge and to send the message to their governments that that's what they want to do. Very difficult, given the vested interest powers that I mentioned in my own talk, but nevertheless, the only way, I can't see another way. I mean, often people say, well, you can withdraw from society and do your own little thing, but then of course you're not dealing with the broader picture. I think we have a responsibility for the collection as well as our own individual selves, the society we live in. So Michelle, tough question, but they have to be regulated properly in terms of financial processes so that we don't have the crisis that we had before in 2008, which has had a very big impact on budgets, government priorities, etc. But secondly, I think they need to be tamed in terms of of what they're doing that is clearly against the public interest. But having been involved in politics, the liquor industry, the gambling industry, the food industry, they are some of the most powerful in our society, and tackling them is not easy, but has to be done if the public interest is your interest.
Yeah, it's indeed a very interesting question. And there I immediately have to think of an action in the Netherlands where there were lots of demonstrations against meat. The chickens that were raised in 4 weeks or so, and they were very cheap in the supermarkets, and so the chickens had no life. And there was an NGO who really protested against that, and they won. And now what you see is that supermarkets do not sell those kind of chickens. So I also believe still in a voice of people and of NGOs that can counteract against these multinationals. Although they have, of course, a very big power, a lot of good marketing strategies and so on. But I do believe that we can fight against it.
But of course, last month or 2 months ago, again, member states at WHO could not vote on a resolution to encourage governments to reduce sugar in drinks.
One comment from my side. At the end, I think I'm really a realistic person. So I know that there is no approach that can resolve all the problems. But on a small scale, again, in a village, in a municipality, in a neighborhood, we can develop solutions that may, for example, a school can decide to have healthy food, and this is a contribution to the solution. We cannot change what the big shops are selling. We can sometimes, somehow, but not everything. But we can do, on a small scale, we have possibilities to change things, to address the context, but there is no solution that we can change everything and have the perfect world. But every contribution is a small step, an important step.
Thank you. We'll draw that to a close. I'd like you to show your appreciation for our speakers, the questions from the floor, and of course the interpreters, please. One final announcement before you go for a quick 15-minute break. So that'll be coming back here for 15 minutes past 5 for the Fast Track Cities panel discussion. I've been asked to remind you again around the Salieri restaurant tonight, and that's in Pale Royal Square at 7 o'clock. Thank you.
Sorry, if you look at your readers, you will find the map how to get to Salieri, and also there will be a bus waiting for people who really cannot walk and it's difficult to get there by foot. So the bus gets 30 people, so first come, first served basis. At 6:30 it will be waiting for you. And for those who want to practice healthy lifestyle tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock, we have morning exercises with our reality TV star, Miroslava Ulyanina. So meeting place is entrance to the hotel. So welcome to the morning exercise at 8 tomorrow.
As we go